about to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's be free with me. Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
What is up, friends? Dan here. Turn that down a little. Hope everyone's doing all right today. What is today? Today's Tuesday, right? All right, just making sure I'm caught up here. As always, I'm just getting back into the flow of things here with streaming, so let me know how everything sounds. Looks like I'm spiking a little, so let me know if I'm a little loud for you. Just trying to get back into the swing of things here. Just give it a couple minutes here and let some people join. Just playing a little music for your Tuesday afternoon listening. So one of the things is I'm just piping in some music that I downloaded from Epidemic Sound. So I have to pull this into my software. So one thing I need to figure out is how I can just kind of pull in my system audio instead of having to drop music into this folder, because that's going to not last for a while. I need to get some playlists together from Epidemic that I could just kind of play in their player and have it come through system audio. So all right, welcome to another live stream. We did one a couple weeks ago. Again, I think one of my new kind of objectives here is to schedule things. Like even today, I probably had something else I could have gotten to, but if I schedule these, then I know I make it a priority. So I have one scheduled for today. I have one scheduled for Friday. I am streaming to YouTube. I'm not on anywhere else right now. I just like YouTube because that's where you guys are. I know there are other places to stream, but I think I'm going to stick with this for now. So hopefully we can keep making these more frequent. Let me know what you want to see out of them. And with that, let's just get to it. So if I could just get some kind of confirmation here in the chat before we get started. Let me know that you can hear me okay. I'm not too loud. If the music's a little bit loud, I'm sorry, that's going to go away in a second. But give me a thumbs up in the chat. Let me know where you're from, what you're hoping to see today, because I definitely have a schedule of what I want to do today. I want to stick to an hour, and I have some things I want to get to. So all right, so let me do this. Let me go ahead and turn off the sound effects for now. And let's get into it. So for anyone new here, my name is Dan Vega. You can find out more about me on danvega.dev. This is a great place to learn more about what I do. I have a blog. I've been blogging since, like 2005 maybe. Oh, thank you. Just throw that on the screen. Sound really good. Thank you so much. Here's a blog here. There's a bunch of blog posts. You can go into the blog and kind of search through the archives. This will allow you to search through everything. And then down here, we have a link to the YouTube channel, but you could find me on all these different networks. So if you ever need a link to where I am, these links are down here. I haven't written a blog post. Hello from the Dominican Republic. Hello to you. Oh, hi Dan. Let me throw this one up there too. Hi Dan, I'm Santiago from Colombia. I'm learning Spring and especially Spring Boot. Well, you're in the right place, because that is what I love talking about, Spring and Spring Boot. So please, as I'm going through things, ask questions. I have no problem kind of taking sidetracks and talking about things. So please do. Hello to you. Thank you for joining. Hello from the Dominican Republic. Anercido. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. I'm terrible with pronunciations. Please correct me on that. Hello from Brazil. Wow, we got everybody here today. This is awesome. Thank you so much, guys, for joining. So something else I just haven't written a blog post on yet, but if you follow me on Twitter, you've probably seen Spring 1. If you go over to speakers and you go down and down and down and down and down and down and down, all the way down. Where is that person? I know he's around here somewhere. There he is. Dan Vega. So I got accepted to speak at Spring 1, which I'm really excited about. Look at all these amazing individuals on here. It's going to be really cool to share the virtual stage with all these wonderful individuals. And I'll be talking on full stack development with Spring Boot and Vue.js. So if you follow me at all, you know I'm a huge fan of Vue.js. So we're going to be talking about, if you wanna build a full stack application with Vue on the front end and Spring Boot on the back end, what are some things you got to think of? What are some considerations you might have before you even start building that application? We'll talk about how to integrate the two. You can keep them as separate applications. You can deploy it as one jar file if you want to. So we'll talk through all of that in this session. So if you haven't signed up for Spring 1 yet, please head over there and sign up for that. I'm not familiar with Spring, but as far as I can tell, it shares similarities with Quarkus. Hoping to get most out of these live trainings. Yeah, absolutely. Spring's been around a long time. I know Quarkus probably drew a lot of inspiration from Spring. I saw Quarkus. I think I first got introduced to that probably about a year ago at, I'm brain fart, but the conference I spoke at in Sandusky here. My friend of mine who was with Red Hat at the time. He was presenting on Quarkus, so I got a good chance to check it out. So that was pretty cool. Also at Quarkus, haven't had a chance to fully dive into it, but maybe that's something we can do on these streams too. So the other thing I want to talk about is IntelliJ IDEA 2021.2 is out, and I'll be using it. I just installed it today, so nothing like a live stream to go ahead and use some new software. There's some really cool features in the new version, so I'm looking to kind of see those as we go. So if you're interested, check that out. What we are doing today is we are continuing on from the previous live stream. So if you didn't get a chance to see it, don't worry. It's on the YouTube channel. You can just kind of stay here with this one and then go back and check out the previous stream. But this is the GitHub repository for the code that we wrote. And really, I'm just going to jump into that code. We'll talk about what we did, and then we'll start to build on that, okay? Great question. How can we make REST APIs scalable and concurrent? That is a loaded question. There's a lot to that question. I guess I would need to know kind of what you're trying to do and what you're trying to scale. So I'll just say this. As with any architecture, there's a lot of, so he followed that up with, how can we make Spring REST APIs scalable and concurrent? So it really depends. I don't want to spend too much time on this, so I'll just kind of give you a quick answer, and then if we want to dive into this further, please shoot me an email on this, and maybe we can go into it and maybe cover that in a future live stream. But scalable, depending on, it really depends. Scalable means a lot of things. So if you have an existing monolithic application and you feel that hey, some of these APIs in here that we have, we really need to be able to scale these. that's where kind of coming in and breaking some of that up into microservices works, because you can scale just the individual APIs or services that get a lot of the traffic. From just a code standpoint, scalable to me means using best practices. So, and a lot of which we're gonna, we started to cover last week and we're starting to cover now is, how do we build out our REST APIs so that they're scalable and maintainable, right? Like using best practices in code. So following the solid principles, writing reusable code, extracting, any code that we may share across our APIs into maybe a base controller class, things like that. So I realize that's not an answer. That's a loaded question, though. If you have a more specific inquiry about that, let me know and we'll get into it. So here is the code. I know we're not looking at it right now. Wow, I thought we were looking at my... Here is the code that we are talking about. Wow, it was not even on my screen the whole time. Sorry about that. So github.com/danvega/REST API demo. Again, because we weren't looking at our screen, this is the danvega.dev I shared. I shared a Spring One link, and I'll put all these in the description below once the live stream ends. And then I'll be using IntelliJ's new 2021.2 version. There's a bunch of cool new options in here, features in here that I'll be using. So this is the repo from last week. We're going to continue working on this. So let's just go ahead and jump into it. So what we started building last week was really a REST API. And what I wanted to talk about last week was really the fact that what I was seeing a lot of was not conforming to kind of the way of building REST APIs. And what we talked about was, let's start with a resource. So the resource in this case, in our application that we're trying to work on, is a book. So let's start with a resource, and everything under that resource should fall under some kind of standard, right? Like we have a request mapping of /API/books, and then any of our methods should fall under that. So when we have a get mapping, we are basically saying that, hey, when you hit /API/books, you are going to get a list of all the books back. This shouldn't be a mapping of something like /API/books/find all, right? You should, conform to REST principles, which is everything falls under that resource, and then we have just our, our different HTTP methods that kind of differentiate all the methods. So we have a get, we have a post to create, we have a put to update, we have a delete to delete. So everything kind of falls under there. So let me I do want to check my notes here. Just want to make sure we cover everything today. Okay, so the one thing I didn't talk about last week was we have these two mappings here, request mapping and get mapping. I don't think I was very explicit about this, but the specialized versions of these mappings are just that. So if we click into that, you can see that this is a request mapping annotation with the method set to whatever that is. So in this case, it's method equals request method.get. So this is really just a shortened version of this. So if you see like mixing the two, that's why you'll see a request mapping, a get mapping. Post is the same thing. It's a request mapping with the method equal to request method.post. So part of getting used to Spring and Spring Boot is a lot of the annotations that really save us a lot. And you'll see more and more annotations. And sometimes, when you are getting started, it could be a little confusing but once you get into the flow of things, they make your life really easy. So I just wanted to mention that because we didn't do that last week. I think what I want to do now, so we started last week with just this internal books array list, and we just added a couple items to that array list, and that was our internal storage of the different books that we were going to use. So I want to move that out, and because this was just for the sake of getting started. Normally we're going to delegate to another class to handle the retrieval of those books, whether it's in memory like it is now, or from a database using something like JDBC or JPA. We're gonna move that responsibility of retrieving data like this to another class, and you always want to do that from a controller perspective, right? This is a controller. Its sole purpose, because we've annotated this with @rest controller, is I am here to respond to requests and return responses. So that is what this is supposed to do. So we really want to keep controllers, and this goes for whatever language or whatever framework you're working in. When it comes to some MVC framework, controllers should be dumb. They are traffic controllers. They are taking in requests, maybe doing something with them and passing them on to something else. But even that doing something with them is very limited. They are really just to take a request and return a response. So any kind of work that we need to do, we want to delegate somewhere else. So what I want to do is I want to delegate to a DAO. So I'm going to create a new package, and we'll call this DAO. And in this case, I'm going to create a new Java class, and I'm going to call it book DAO.java. And in this case, I'm actually going to create an interface. So let's talk about this. We're going to have an interface here. And what we want this to do is, so I'm not one for ceremony. I'm not one for creating interfaces and implementations just because everybody else does. But in this case, it makes sense to me because right now I'm going to create an in-memory book DAO that just worries about books in an array list. And so every time we restart the application, that's going to kind of reset. Later on, we'll create a JDBC implementation of that will retrieve books from the database. So these are two very different implementations, but at the same time, we want them to be able to do the same things. I want to be able to get all of the books. I want to be able to find a book by an ID. I want to be able to delete a book. I want to be able to save a book, etc. And so to do that, I'm going to create a contract here that says, hey, this is what I want to adhere to. So anybody who implements me, any class that implements me, you've got to provide an implementation for all of these methods. So let's talk about what these are. So first we're going to start with an optional book. And we're going to say this is a find by ID, and it's going to take an integer. And we need to import that. So that's our first one. We're saying hey, we want to be able to find by an ID. We also want a list of books, and that is going to be a find all. We want to return a count. We want to, let me just take myself out of this for now so we don't take up all the screen here. I'm going to return a book when I create a new book. And I'm going to take a book. And again, I kind of know this already because this is kind of CRUD stuff that I'm used to doing, but that's why I'm mocking out this interface first here. So int ID and void delete, which is going to take an ID. So these are the basic methods that I wanted to provide. So that little save there that I just did, wasn't aware that was going to happen, but that was part of IntelliJ new version, actions on save. So that reformatted my code. So again, you can kind of really customize all this stuff, but I haven't done that yet. So we're just going to run with it today. So usually I don't have the spaces like that, but that's okay. So we want to find by ID, find all, count, create, update, delete. So that's really our CRUD implementation, or our CRUD list of methods that we want. So now what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to create a new Java class, and we're going to call this one, make sure I'm in here, in memory book DAO. And yes, we'll go ahead and add that. And so what we want to do now is a couple things. So one, we want to go ahead and implement that interface that we just created. So now when we do that, it's going to complain. It's going to say, hey, or no warnings are on. It's still indexing. So I think that part of this new version of IntelliJ is like scanning the entire project, which I don't think I like. I think you could turn that off. So, but ultimately, it's going to complain about that. And what we need to do when this is done is we're going to need to implement all of those methods. But really what I'm doing here is we have this list of books and a couple of books that we added. And what I want to do is move that into our in-memory book DAO. So let's do that. So really what we're doing is, maybe we can save some time here, and say private list books is array list, and then we'll need a constructor. I'm not sure why this is taking so long to do this. But because it's doing that, it's blocking me from using all the features I like to use. So let's say in-memory book DAO. And what I want to do is, let's create a method called load books. And still can't do anything while we're indexing. I wonder if there's a way to turn off this project scan. I did read something that the new version of IntelliJ was doing that. Not sure why it's indexing that. Alright, well, we don't need that help. We'll go ahead and say load books. And what I want to do here is just create a method, and we'll say load books, and I think we can just grab this information here. So I'm going to get rid of all this now, which is going to cause some errors, but we're okay with that. But I do love this autosave. I don't have to worry about, it just kind of fixes stuff. So we're going to say books.add. Okay, so all we're doing here, again, back in our controller before, we were setting this up to create a new array list, and then we were adding some books to that array list using the controller's constructor. Again, controllers are pretty dumb. We don't want to do that kind of thing here. So we're going to delegate that over to the in-memory book DAO. Now, we have to find a way. I really wish this would stop. This is bothering me. I really have to find out. Now what I have to do is, you'll see that in here, we're doing things like returning books, return book.stream. So we're using that internal book array list that we defined in the controller before, but we no longer have that, right? We need to go ahead and get those books from the in-memory book DAO. So this is where one of the most important concepts in Spring comes to light. This is an interview question I ask a lot. To really, if you understand dependency injection, you'll understand a lot of what Spring is built on. And so Spring has this idea of dependency injections and inversion of control. You're handing over control to. I'm just grabbing a. No name is kick-ass. This would be my 100th getting started with Spring Boot video crying. I don't know if that's a good crying or a bad crying. It sounds like a bad one. I'm sorry if this is basic, but we're going to start building on this. We're going to do some more fun stuff. I just wanted to start somewhere. So dependency ejection, really important. What we need to do is we need to take away the control from us, and what we want to do here is we want to ask the Spring framework for an instance of a class instead of creating our own instances. So what do I mean by that? Let's talk through the example and maybe it'll be more clear. So let's say that we had a book controller constructor here, and what we needed was a in-memory, well actually, so we'll call it a book DAO. Let's call it a DAO. So we needed an instance of our DAO to go ahead and be able to get a list of books. One way that we could do that is right here in our controller. We could say this.dao is equal to new in-memory book DAO, right? We could do that. But the problem with this is that every time this controller is loaded, we're basically, every time the constructor is called, we're calling new. So we're creating a new instance of the in-memory book DAO. That could be one problem, especially in a controller where that is loaded on every single request, right? It may become less of a problem in a singleton, but even in that instance, this becomes harder to test as well. So we're not able to mock out that in-memory book DAO, which you normally would want to do in, say, a unit test. We just want to test the controller, not the functionality in the memory book DAO. So there are a bunch of reasons that this approach is kind of bad. So what we want to say here, and it looks like it finally stopped analyzing. So let's go ahead and import that. So now we didn't. Okay, so let's come back to this. We'll go back to dependency injection. Now that it stopped scanning, we got all our errors. So the other thing we want to do in here is we have to implement all of those methods that we talked about. So just using the IDE to generate those stubs will satisfy that. So coming back to dependency injection, we've declared that we want a book DAO. We have a instance variable of type book DAO, and somehow we need to get an instance of that. And we just talked about creating our own instance could be potentially bad for a couple of reasons. So how do we get a book instance here in our controller? And so that's where Spring comes in. Spring's inversion of control is going to basically take over that ownership. Spring is going to create the instance for us, and then we're just going to ask Spring for an instance. And the way that this happens is by basically letting Spring know where our different components in our application are. So right now we can't do anything because Spring is not managing this in-memory book DAO for us. But the second we come in here and say that this is a repository, which is really just a specialized version of the component annotation, and the component annotation is where such classes are considered candidates for auto detection. And really that auto detection is what is important. Is now Spring is going, you are basically telling Spring, hey, this is a class I want you to manage for me. I want you to create an instance for me, right? So when Spring starts up, it'll create an instance of the in-memory book DAO, and all we're doing is we're asking for an instance because you have one already. And so the way that you can do that is you can go ahead and add a constructor parameter. And what that'll do is, if you look over here in this gutter icon in IntelliJ, you can see that it is figuring out that you can, that it is getting auto-wired in for you, right? So in this instance, we now have a version of the book DAO when the constructor is called. And so this is a good thing. This is the same thing as annotating this with @AutoWired. So you may have seen this before. As of like Spring 4.2 or something, 4.3, you no longer need to do this if you have just a single constructor. So that's why we're doing that there. So we're going to fix the other errors, but any questions on kind of dependency injection, the book DAO, what we were doing there? Can you change the DAO implementation class based on some configuration? Yes. So the thing is, right now, we only have a single DAO implementation. Once we get to multiple ones, Spring is not going to know what you're talking about. Hey, which one do you want? And that's where the qualifier annotation comes into play. So you could start to say, you can get specific on like which one you actually want. So yes, there are ways, once you have multiple implementations, to kind of qualify that. Raul says, "Good night, Indians." I wonder if that is in reference to the Cleveland Indians, which are now the Cleveland Guardians. Good night, Raul. Okay, so again, if you have any questions on what we've done so far, let me know. I think what we'll do is we'll just go through this. We'll start with the controller. Okay, so the find all is pretty easy. So instead of returning books, which is no longer there, we're just going to use the DAO, and now we're going to call our find all method. So let's go ahead and we're not going to be able to do anything until we fix some of these. So let's just move that for now. And what I want to do now is just go ahead and run this application. And I mentioned this in the last live stream, but we are started on 8080. One way I really like to test these APIs now is using the internal HTTP client in IntelliJ. So I'm going to generate a request for this, and let's just get rid of all, well, let's just leave those. We might use those later. So now what I can do is actually just run this, and response body is empty. All right, should be fun. How to handle, how to handle exceptions. Really good question. Hopefully we'll get to that today. There are, as with everything in Spring, there are a bunch of different ways that you can do things, just depending on your needs. So we'll talk about that. I think one of the first exceptions we'll kind of get to is something like a 404. So if you ask for a book by its ID and that ID doesn't exist, how do you handle that exception? Actual programming, if you have specific exceptions that you'd like to look at, let me know. But we'll try and get to some of that. So let's talk about this. We have response body is empty. So something we are doing. Let's just double check. So we are asking our DAO to find all. Find all is returning null. So let's go ahead and fix that. I don't know if I have DevTools installed. We should probably do that too. So if DevTools are installed, and you got to set something up in IntelliJ to make that happen, but basically on save you can get it to restart every time. But basically we are now asking our DAO to use that internal array list and return all of the books in that array list. So let's go ahead and run that again. And there are our 2 books. So now we've taken what we were doing in the controller and we've delegated that responsibility to the DAO layer. So that is just one of them. Let's talk about another one. So I'm going to get rid of this. So what we want to do basically is so let's talk about this. So this is basically going to look like this. So we have, again, at the request mapping level, we have /API/books, and then we're going to have an ID. So back over here, we had, back over here, we had 2 IDs, just 1 and 2. So those are the 2 books that we're going to look for. So URI might look like this, /API/books/1. So when that is the case, we're basically saying that, hey, this value right here is something that we care about. And this is basically denoting that this is a dynamic variable, right? Like this could be a 1, this could be a 2, this could be anything. And what we're saying here is, I want you to go ahead and map whatever this is. So this argument is of type integer named ID, and I want you to pull that out of the path. So we're going to take that and use it as an argument to this method. So now we can take that 1 and delegate that to our DAO. So we're going to say DAO.findById, and we're going to pass the ID. Now remember, if I hit return, we're still going to have a problem here. If we look at our contract here, we said that, hey, we want to return an optional book. And so optionals help us deal with the existence of null values. And so instead of just returning a book, as somebody mentioned earlier, what about exceptions? What happens when we ask for book 99 and don't have it? In this case, we are still going to get back an optional book. There's just not going to be anything present. So this is one way of handling that particular use case. So what I want to do is over here in my find by ID, So what we want to do is we want to return an optional here. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to take the books array list, and I need to find that particular book. This is where a hash map may have come up better, just to store like the ID and then the actual book. But I have an array list, so this is what I'm working with. But I can use the filter method to say, go ahead and find me that book.getID is equal to that ID. And then the find first method, so I'm basically saying just give me the first one. There's not going to be multiple ones with an ID of 1 or 2. Find me that first one. If you look here, that actually returns an optional book. So that will satisfy that contract for us. So that's returning a optional book. So we probably just need to, now what we need to do is figure out, okay, if we're getting an optional book, how do we handle that here? Sorry, I'm just getting some questions. Oh no, my light went out. Is it good practice to return 404 when the requested resource does not exist? 404 makes it look like URL may be wrong. Well, that's where, sending a particular message along with that error really helps out. So I don't think that is wrong. 404 makes it sound like it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. When you hit /API/books/99, that is a resource that you're expecting to get back. And when you send back a 404 and say, hey, that book with the ID of 99 does not exist, that's exactly what you are doing. You are requesting something that I cannot find. So, no, I'm okay with that. Small question about IOC, why we should avoid @AutoWired and use dependency injection using constructor. What's the difference? Any case in which we should avoid using constructor injection. So I think basically what you're asking is why, can I use just @AutoWired on the instance variable? And the rule of thumb is just use constructor injection. This uses then, there's some reflection going underneath the hood. It gets tricky to test. There are just some things that make that a little bit trickier. Rule of thumb is there's no reason not to use constructor injection. Just always use constructor injection for your dependencies. Okay. So now let's come back to this and talk about this. So one way that we could do this is, and I guess I'm just talking through this for anyone who hasn't used optional before, because I know, some people may not have. So in one instance, we can say, sorry, my mic's in my way. So in one instance, we can say, let me get the DAO.findByID and return the ID. So that is going to return an optional book, right? We could say, hey, if that book is present, I want you to go ahead and return the book.get. And we'll talk about this in a second. Else, we could do something like throw new runtime exception. Book with ID of what's not found. So we could do something like this. So if you're not familiar with optionals, So we have this optional, we're returning an optional book. There's a method called isPresent, and that is basically going to tell us if the value is there, it's going to return true, otherwise false. So we're asking it, is there something there? I don't want a null, or I don't want to run across a null pointer exception where I try to access something that isn't there. So we're saying, hey, if the book is present, now I know I can call this get method. And on this get method, it's basically going to return the value. So if book is present, return the value, else let's throw a runtime exception. So let's start there. We're going to improve upon this. For everybody out there probably yelling at me that there's a better way to do this, we will go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and say 1. And if we ask for 1, we get back the book that we are looking for. If we ask for 99, we are basically not getting that book back. And that's a 500, so we are probably not dealing with it correctly. No, that should be path. If book is present, return book.get. Oh, so this is, what we want to see is this getting thrown. So it seems like we're getting there, huh? Let's do a little debugging here, just for some fun. Alright, so we get a book back. It is empty. So I don't know why it's not throwing my message, but oh, there it is. Book with an ID 99 was not found. Okay, so it's not just not coming back in the JSON, which is fine. So this is one way of handling that. Another way is we can kind of shorten this. So with an optional, we can go ahead and say we want to get that. So that's going to return an optional of a book. And on the optional API, we have a or else throw. So this is kind of a shortcut for what we did up there of doing the is present, go ahead and get the book, if not throw a new error. And so that we can just say is a new runtime exception, and we can do this same thing that we did up here, and we can throw that. So now that may help. Why did I do that? So now we've kind of taken this and slimmed it down a little. So we're basically saying, hey, go return us that optional. The optional has a method on there called or else throw, which takes a supplier. So we have the application started. If we go ahead and hit this again, book with ID 99 was not found. So that's just a nice, easy way to kind of, again, we're building on this and building on this. There, as we start to introduce more complexity, there are other ways to handle this, but I figured I'd kind of start off and start there. So you had another good question here. Do you prefer returning class or response entities in controllers? So this really depends on the API contract, right? Like what is your caller looking for? If I have to, in most cases, I wouldn't say most cases, there are a lot of times where you need to send additional data, right? Maybe you're attaching some headers to it, some custom headers. Maybe you want to, set the actual status. And in those cases where you want to kind of adjust what is being returned, then you need a response entity. So what Oren is mentioning is instead of returning this book, you can go ahead and return a response entity, and this would be of type book. And so the response entity is a class here that extends the HTTP entity. And so this is part of Spring that adds HTTP status codes used in REST template as well as controller methods. And this just gives us an opportunity to, again, add some information to the response if we need to. So for me, in this case, I'm either going to return a 200 or this is going to throw an error if this is not found. Now there's more things that could come later when we start talking about validation. Maybe we throw a 404 there, but again, Spring will kind of do that for us. So you're going to hear me say this a lot, and it probably bothers everyone because it bothered me for the longest time, but it just depends. It really depends what your situation is. Hopefully we'll keep building on complexity throughout these live streams, and we'll see how that changes over time. But for now, for this simple example, I'm okay with what we're doing here. So let's get rid of this. The next thing we need to do is create a book. And I think we have time to go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and call our DAO. And what we'll do is we'll create a book. And what we need to do in our in-memory book is we need to take in that book and create a new one. So let's go ahead here and say, one thing that we need to do here, so in a database world, you probably be auto incrementing these IDs. We are not using a database. We are manually setting 1, 2, 3, and so I need a way to set the ID here. So we could write a function to go ahead and find like the largest ID and then just add 1. But I'm just going to pull this in. So we have a count method, right? So count plus 1, but this is books, but that's going to return a long. And then, so I probably need to do that. So I'm just getting whatever the count is and adding 1 to it. And that should satisfy that. Again, this is just for an in-memory representation of these books. We're just playing with some things. So now what I want to do is I have that book array. I want to go ahead and set the index. I'm sorry, I don't need to. I'm just going to go ahead and add that now that I have that book. And then I'm going to go ahead and return that book. So I think that's okay for now. And then we're not returning anything from here. Again, this depends on what your caller needs. If your caller wanted the book back so that it can find out the ID of that instant, of that newly created book, then you could recreate, you could return a book here, and maybe we'll do that next. We'll return a book, and one thing I like to do, especially on a create, is set the status code to a 201 created. So Oren, that kind of answers your question there. I'd probably return either a response entity or just use the annotation on the method to explicitly return back that 201. So now next thing we got to worry about is, okay, how are we going to get this book? We are going to create a book. Somebody is going to call our API. In our case, we're going to use the HTTP client here within IntelliJ. You may use Postman, whatever you're using to send a request that contains a book and create it. Pavan, hi Dan, I have a question related to the REST template. Feel free to shoot. I was confused with the DAO and repository classes. I read it's two different patterns. Which is should why we use and why. There. So again, you'll see repositories used when we go ahead and if you start using Spring Data, you'll create repositories that extend, say, like a CRUD repository. For me, in this demo, a DAO is just a way to retrieve data. A repository is very similar. I get that there are two different patterns, but in this case, the only thing that I'm calling a repository here, it's called a DAO class, is that repository annotation. This really doesn't matter. It could be component for all we care. All we're doing is telling Spring that this is a class I need you to manage for me. So how are we going to get this book? The way that we're going to get this is that we need to somehow tell Spring that this book is going to be sent in as part of the request body. And so that's what the request body annotation does. It says, hey, I'm going to indicate to you that the parameter that you have here should be bound to the body of the web request. So this is the body that we're sending in. If you've been in Postman and you have that body area where you can put it in, you can go ahead and send that in as part of the request. So we're saying, hey, this book is actually part of the web request. So let's go ahead and rerun this. And I'm going to go ahead and create this. So generate a request. So we have, again, this is a post. We're conforming to our /API/books. And what we can do here is, do I have a post option? Yeah, I just want to grab this. Content type is application/JSON, and here's an example. Now I'm not going to pass in the ID because if you remember back in our in-memory book DAO, we're going to take in a book that doesn't have an ID because nobody's going to know the ID. We don't know how many book. If we had 10 in there, how are you going to know that this one that I'm trying to save is the 11th? So I'm just going to take in a book, and we'll do some little magic here to set the ID for that book by getting the count and adding 1 to it. And then we add that book to the books array list, and then when we find all, we should see that new book added. So let's go here and give this a whirl. Okay, so this is what I was talking about before. We are getting in 200 here, so everything is okay. What I really like to see in this instance, though, as someone calling an API, is a 201 status code to let me know that, yes, everything's okay, and that was actually created. Everything went okay there. But if we go back up and we start to, let's go ahead and list all of our API, all of our books. We can now see that we have 3 books here in our in-memory map, or our in-memory list. So that ID was created for us correctly, and then these values were set in. I think I had new publish in there because I was trying to post something last week, or put something last week. So that is that. So that's the request body. That's how we take something in the web request and use that body and bind it to the book. Now, this isn't magic. It may seem really cool and seem like magic at first, but it's not. This is using Jackson under the hood. And so it takes whatever you sent, and now it can bind it to that book class, that Pojo that we have. And again, that isn't magic. So I want to talk more about Jackson, and we'll probably do that in the next episode. That's kind of what we'll kick off with, some Jackson, and we will finish out these 2 methods here. So I have that scheduled for Friday, I believe, at 4 o'clock. So let me kick some music up here. Go back here. See if I got some questions here. When you try to call an external API, how do you handle the exceptions thrown by the external API? There could be any exception thrown by the API. There is, yeah. And so one of the things, you're not always going to have this, but one of the things we do where I work is we have an API first contract. So we build out an API contract in OpenAPI, we put it in a Swagger doc, we say, here's what the request looks like, here's what the response looks like, and here are the number of exceptions that we will throw. And here's what that response, here's what that exception looks like. So if you're lucky enough to have that, that's great, because you'll know what you have to account for. If you don't have that, this is where testing comes into play everywhere, but especially, trying to anticipate what are some of those things that are going to come up, and writing tests for those to handle those situations. So tests aren't always about testing the happy path. It's more, for testing everything that could possibly come up. So when I write a test for the find by ID, I'm going to write a test that says, hey, when I give you a valid ID, I expect to get a book back. When I give you an invalid ID, I expect to be thrown some exception and have some message sent back to me. Those are scenarios that you have to think about, and tests are a really good way to kind of handle those. All right. Let me just see this one more time. Again, I didn't. If you get a chance, head over to danvega.dev. We are scheduled for Friday. If you want to find out about that, you can always go over to my YouTube channel and take a look at the list of live ones are always scheduled there. If you're subscribed there, you'll get a notification when I set those up. So Friday we're going to continue on this. We'll just play a little bit more with Jackson and understand that it's not magic, because it seems like it is, and understand how Jackson kind of works. And then we'll finish out that controller. And if we finish all that, we're going to move on to working with databases. So we have this in-memory representation of what our books look like. I want to move on to introducing a database. Again, I will push the code that we've been working on here to this GitHub repository. So github.com/danvega/REST API demo. And we'll go ahead and put the code up there. All right, if I don't have any other questions, thanks for hanging out with me on I keep saying Wednesday. Thanks for hanging out with me on a Tuesday afternoon. I appreciate it. I appreciate you guys asking the questions. Oh, I do got one more question. Let me just answer that. Looks really good. I was wondering if you're planning to add a service layer to further operations. Yes. So we'll find a way to work that in. So a service layer is really good for any business logic that you want to delegate from the controller. Again, we don't want to do that in the controller. If we wanted to send an email every time a book was created, don't do that. But if we wanted to do that, that is something we would delegate to, say, a service layer. So we'll find a good reason to go ahead and throw in a service and build some functionality into there too. All right. So again, thanks everyone for joining me today. I appreciate the questions. And again, always feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. On my website, there's a contact form. Let me know what you want to see from these live streams. I know I got the comment earlier that this is my 100th getting started demo. I know some of these are basics, but even if you pick up like one little thing every stream, I think it's worth it. So let me know what you want to see, and let me know if, give me a shout out on Twitter if these are helping you, or if you're interested in more of these. Yeah, and we'll keep going with these. I have fun doing these. So till Friday, happy coding, everyone.